One particularly important and very interesting kind of technology that's involved in Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, that's absolutely central, we could say, for the world building involved, actually in two different ways, is something that gets referred to as Cold-Pac and also induces a state called half-life. So Cold-Pac itself is a way of extending the life to a certain extent, mainly the consciousness of people after their bodies have physically died in some way. So long as the brain can be activated soon enough, you can keep it going in a certain way. And it's called Cold-Pac because you're using cryogenics to make this happen. And the person can be woken up from time to time. They only get so much extra time due to it. And so you kind of have to ration it out. It doesn't keep people from dying completely, which eventually does happen, but it allows them to continue an existence of a sort where, they're in their own world, we could say. That's why world building in a double sense. There's an interior world, and then there's the world in which this technology, and we could say institution, affects society. And so this is going to play a really central role in the story, one that's absolutely irreplaceable for reasons that we'll talk about in just a moment. So our first encounter with it is, understandably enough, in the very first chapter of the work. And Glenn Runsiter, one of the main characters involved here, says that he is going to go and consult his dead wife. How do you do that? Well, he has to go to a moratorium. And the moratorium that he goes to is in Switzerland because apparently the Swiss are a bit better at this. And he's going to meet up with this other second importance character who plays a role at different points. Herbert Schönheit von Vogelsang, who runs this moratorium in Switzerland. And we get to see his thoughts about things. And it's kind of interesting to follow them out. So as the owner of the beloved Brethren Moratorium, Vogelsang perpetually came to work before his employees. At this moment, with the chilly, echoing building just beginning to stir, a worried-looking clerical individual with nearly opaque glasses and wearing a tabby fur blazer and pointed yellow shoes waited at the reception counter, a claim check stub in his hand. Now, claim checks, sort of like getting your coat, right? You have a little token that allows you to say, hey, I want to go talk to this person. And it says, obviously he'd shown up to holiday greet a relative. Resurrection Day, the holiday on which the half-lifers were publicly honored, lay just around the corner. The rush would soon be beginning. So this has started to affect their society, right? And we find out that it's an elderly lady, about 80, very small and wizened, my grandmother. So he's going to talk to her. And now we get a really interesting little reflection. When he located the correct party, he scrutinized the lading report attached. It gave only 15 days of half-life remaining. Not very much, he reflected. Automatically, he pressed a portable protophazon amplifier into the transparent plastic hull of the casket, tuned it, listened at the proper frequency for indication of cephalic activity, and then we get a little glimpse of her thoughts going on, right? And so, he has this person talk with the lady, and then we get another reflection by Vogelsang. He says, when I pass, I'll will my heirs to revive me one day a century. That way I can observe the fate of all mankind. But that meant a rather high maintenance cost to the heirs, and he knew what that meant. Sooner or later they would rebel, have his body taken out of Cold-Pac, and God forbid, buried. Burial is barbaric, Herbert muttered aloud, remnant of the primitive origins of our culture. So what we see here is that burial still goes on. But a lot of people, if you can pay the maintenance fees, get to partake in this institution. So that's quite interesting. And, we read a little bit more about what goes on here. He runs into Runciter, who's going to say, I don't have a claim check. You know who I'm talking about. Runciter is kind of a preferred customer because he's a big business boss, right? So we learn a good bit about these half-lifers, and Runciter gets to have a sort of a private room to talk to Ella. So now we move on to chapter 2, right? Ella Runciter lay in her transparent casket, her hands lifted permanently towards her impassive face. It had been 3 years since he'd seen Ella, and she had not changed. She never would now, at least not in the outward physical way, but with each resuscitation into active half-life, into a return of cerebral activity, however short, Ella died somewhat. The remaining time left to her pulse phased out and ebbed. And, Ella is very young. She died as a young wife. Glenn is an old man. So this has been going on for quite a while. And they are going to communicate, and they're going to talk about business matters. And that's interesting. But what we're really interested in here is what else is revealed about half-life as an experience. So one of the things has to do with the kind of afterlife. The afterlife she's experiencing, and then what will happen later. So he says, how did it feel, he wondered, to be in half-life? He could never fathom it from what Ella told him. The basis of it, the experience of it, couldn't really be transmitted. Gravity, she told him, once it begins not to affect you and you float more and more. When half-life is over, she had said, I think you float out of the system, out into the stars. But she didn't know either. She only wondered and conjectured. She did not, however, seem afraid or unhappy, and he felt glad of that. So then they talk some more, and then she says, I was dreaming. I saw a smoky red light, a horrible light, and I kept moving towards it. I couldn't stop. Runciter says, yeah, the Bardo Tootle, the Tibetan Book of the Dead tells about that. You remember reading that. The doctors made you read it when you were dying. The smoky red light is bad, isn't it? Ella said. Yeah, you want to avoid it. He cleared his throat, and then he goes back to talking about the business problems. And then she reveals something else that's quite interesting. She says, I've been dreaming all this time since you last talked to me. Do you know what I think, Glenn? I think that the other people who are around me, we seem to be progressively growing together. A lot of my dreams aren't about me at all. Sometimes I'm a man, sometimes a little boy, sometimes an old fat woman with varicose veins, and I'm in places I've never seen doing things that make no sense. And then he conjectures, well, like they say, you're heading for a new womb to be born out of, and that smoky red light, that's a bad womb. You don't want to go that way. That's a humiliating, low sort of womb. You're probably anticipating your next life or whatever it is. We read, he felt foolish talking like this. Normally, he had no theological convictions. Now notice this line. But the half-life experience was real, and it made theologians out of all of them. Right? And they go on and talk some more business, and then something happens. Suddenly, he's not able to talk with her. Why? Because somebody else is on the line. Jory. Not Ella's thoughts, a different Elan, more vital and yet clumsier, without her deft subtlety. And Runciter says, get off the line. I was talking to my wife, Ella. Where'd you come from? He says, I'm Jory, and no one talks to me. I'd like to visit with you a while, mister, if that's okay with you. What's your name? And Runciter says, I want my wife, Miss Ella Runciter. I paid to talk to her, and that's who I want to talk to, not you. And he says, oh, I know Mrs. Runciter. She talks to me, but it isn't the same as somebody like you talking to me, somebody in the world. Mrs. Runciter is here where we are. It doesn't count because she doesn't know any more than we do. What year is it, mister? Did they send that big ship to Proxima? I'm very interested in that. Maybe you can tell me. And if you want, I can tell Mrs. Runciter later on. So Runciter raises a big stink and, he tells Fogelsong, I'll sue you. I'll close down this place. And the idea is we need to get her away from Jory. And why is this happening? Because she has been close to Jory in the place. So he says, when we return her to the bin, we won't install her near Jory again. In fact, if you're agreeable as to paying the somewhat larger monthly fee, we can place her in a high-grade, isolated chamber with walls coated in Teflon 26 so as to inhibit any heteropsychic infusion. That is a psychic infusion from somebody else. And will it work? They don't actually know. So that's revealing a lot to us. Now, this becomes no longer background matter, but something really central to the plot when there's an assassination attempt made up on the moon on Runciter and Joe Chip and the inertial team that they have brought along to Stanton Mick's place. So, Runciter is, we think, killed, and Joe takes charge, and he says, we need to get him into Cold-Pac right away. If we can get Runciter into Cold-Pac soon enough, then he can still run the firm the way his wife does, and they managed to get him into Cold-Pac. However, as we're going to find out, they didn't actually get Runciter into Cold-Pac, not because they, didn't manage it in their memories they did, but what we actually find out is that they died. Runciter is the only one who actually survived, except for one man who's basically brain dead, right? So we're going to read, that Joe is going to say, we may never hear the voice or thoughts of Glenn Runciter again. We might have to run Runciter Associates without him. And it's actually going to be the opposite of that. And Runciter himself is going to intervene in ways that we'll look at in greater detail later on into their consciousnesses. So in chapter 9, Runciter is going to reveal to them through hints what the actual status is. So we read, in crayon or purple ballpoint pen ink, the words read, jump in the urinal and stand on your head. I'm the one who's alive. You're all dead. And Joe says, yeah, that's Runciter's writing. And Al says, now we know the truth. And what is it? Well, he says, but we're not dead except for Wendy. And Al says, we're in half-life. Probably still on Pratfall 2. We're probably on our way back to Earth from Luna after the explosion that killed us, not Runciter. And he's trying to pick up the flow of protophasons from us. So far he's failed. We're not getting across from our world to his, but he managed to reach us. We're picking him up everywhere, even places we chose at random. So that's an interesting realization. Runciter is going to confirm this very clearly in chapter 14, where he says, I'm not dead, Joe. The graffiti told the truth. You're all in Cold-Pac, and I'm sitting in a consultation lounge at the beloved Brethren Moratorium. All of you are interwired on my instructions, kept together as a group. I'm out here trying to reach you. That's where I am when I say I'm outside. That's why the manifestations, as you call them, for 1 week now, I've been trying to get you all functioning in half-life, but it isn't working. You're fading out one by one. And Joe asks, well, what about Pat Conley, who's a sort of antagonist, but not the chief antagonist, as we're going to find out. And Runciter says, yeah, she's in with you, interwired to the rest of the group. And they talk about the decay factor that's going on. And Runciter says, well, the normal decay, Ella experienced it. Everyone who enters half-life experienced it. And Joe says, you're lying to me. And Runciter says, Joe, my God, I saved your life. I broke through to you enough to bring you back into full half-life functioning. You'll probably go on indefinitely now. If I hadn't been waiting here in this hotel room when you came crawling through that door, you'd be lying on that run-down bed dead as a doornail if it wasn't for me. I'm Glenn Runsiter. I'm your boss, and I'm the one fighting to save all your lives. I'm the only one out here in the real world plugging for you. And so, what we're going to find out, Joe is talking about Pat Conley, and Runsiter says, the situation is very complex, Joe. It doesn't admit to simple answers. And then Joe realizes something. You don't know the answers. That's the problem. You made up answers. You had to invent them to explain your presence here. All your presences, your so-called manifestations. But you don't actually know what's going on. Although Runsiter does have the Ubik, which he uses to help him out. And we are going to learn a little bit more in the conversation a bit later. And so we learn, this is Cold-Pac, Joe said, but there's something more. Something not natural to people in half-life. There's two forces at work, as Al figured out. One helping us, one destroying us. You're working with the force or entity or person that's trying to help us. You got the Ubik from them. And Runsiter says, yes. Joe says, so none of us even know who it is that's destroying us and who it is that's protecting us. You outside don't know, and we in here don't know. Maybe it's Pat. And Runsiter says, yeah, I think it is. And then Joe says, almost, but I don't think so. I don't think we've met our enemy face to face, or our friend either. And then he says, are you sure that you're beyond doubt the only one who survived the blast? Think before you answer. And he says, like I said, Zoe Wirt of us, Joe said. She's not here in this time segment with me. Pat Conley, for example. Pat Conley's chest was crushed. She died of shock and a collapsed lung. Physically speaking, she's about 4 feet away from you, her body, I mean. And then Runsiter says, oh, there is one exception. Sammy Mundo, he suffered massive brain damage and lapsed into a coma, out of which they say he'll never emerge. And Joe says, okay, then he's alive. He's not in Cold-Pac. He's not here. And he is actually in their experience. So it's going to turn out that's who's concealing the harmful force, Jory. And we're going to encounter the one who's trying to help out, who turns out to be Ella Runsiter. So she gets him the Ubik that he needs and a guarantee of a free lifetime supply of Ubik for the rest of his half-life. And he asks, well, who are you? And she says, my name is Ella. Ella Hyde Runsiter, your employer's wife. And Joe says, you're here with us on this side, you're in Cold-Pac. And she says, as you well know, I have been for some time. Fairly soon I'll be reborn into another womb, I think, at least Glenn says so. I keep dreaming about a smoky red light, and that's bad. That's not a morally proper womb to be born into. And Joe says, aha, you're the other one. Jory destroying us, you trying to help. I've reached the last entities involved. And he says, why are you working against Jory? And her answer is, because Jory invaded me. He menaced me in the same way he's menaced you. We know what he does. Sometimes he becomes very powerful. On occasion, he manages to supplant me when I'm active and trying to talk with Glenn. But I seem to be better able to cope with him better than most half-lifers, with or without Ubik, better, for instance, than your group even acting as a collective. And now she reveals her motivation. When I'm reborn, Glenn won't be able to consult with me anymore. I have a very selfish, practical reason for assisting you, Mr. Chip. I want you to replace me. I want to have someone whom Glenn can ask for advice and assistance, who he can lean on. You will be ideal. You're doing in half-life what you did in full life. So in a sense, I'm not motivated by noble sentiments, and God knows I detest Jory. And Joe says, well, after you're reborn, won't I succumb? And she says, oh, you've got a lifetime supply of Ubik, as it says on the certificate. And he says, well, maybe I can actually defeat him. Now, she ends up saying something very, very interesting here. So Joe says, I'll tell Glenn Runsiter the situation and have him move Jory out of the moratorium entirely. And she says, Herbert von Fogelsang is paid a great deal of money annually by Jory's family to keep him with the others and think of plausible reasons for doing so. And here's the big reveal. There are Jorys in every moratorium. This battle goes on wherever you have half-lifers. It's a verity, a rule of our kind of existence. It has to be fought on our side of the glass by those of us in half-life, those that Jory preys upon. You'll have to take charge, Mr. Chip, after I'm reborn. Do you think you can do it? It'll be hard. Jory will be sapping your strength away, always, putting a burden on you that you'll feel as the approach of death, which it will be, because in half-life we diminish constantly. Jory only speeds it up. And so what we're getting revealed here is, in half-life you are still dying, but there are malignant entities who are other human beings in half-life who steal your life, who use the strength that they have to try to maintain their own strength at the expense of others. In this case, it's Jory, but in other moratoriums, it would be different people. So this gives us not a completely full, but at least a partial glimpse into what half-life is like, enabled by this technology of Cold-Pac, which to some degree is at least a temporary, partial overcoming of death.